Well, hello and welcome back. Today we're talking about Karl Rahner, who was probably the most influential Catholic theologian of the 20th century, and certainly the most influential theologian at the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s. Karl Rahner is a voluminous theologian. He's written many books and articles, and it would be impossible to categorize everything that he says in one talk. So what we'll do is focus on merely one aspect of his thought that gets to the center of what Rahner is trying to do. Rahner can best be understood as a mediating theologian. He's trying to mediate between extremes at all times, finding a way through where two sides have camped down against each other and made an intractable problem in theology. Rahner thinks there might be a way through, and so he's always focused on that. We start out with the first, which is God's sovereignty and human freedom. This has always been a difficult one for theologians, and Karl Rahner simply says they can't be opposed to each other. God created human beings, intending human beings to be with him, and God's intent from eternity past was to be with human beings. So they can't be in conflict with each other. It's not God's sovereignty or human freedom. Both were for each other. A second thing that Karl Rahner is trying to do is to forge a middle ground between Old Catholicism and modernism. He wants to avoid both. Old Catholicism is that Vatican I mentality, that fundamentalist sensibility that entrenched itself against the modern world, would not have anything to do with the reason of the modern world as it understood it. And yet Rahner sees it using categories from the modern world to make its arguments, and it's become a bit artificial, a bit old, a bit stagnant, and is not very useful to the situation of today. But on the other hand, and Rahner is very clear about this, he does not want to give to the modern world what the modern world wants. He does not want to let theology go and subsume it in modern thought. Christian theology is mystery. It goes deeper than anything that philosophical reflection could get at, anything that modernity could promise, and so Rahner wants to protect the essence of Christian faith, even in a modern society. We might best understand Rahner, and I'd like to suggest that we focus on understanding him this way, as a mediating point between, say, Bart and Schleiermacher. Remember with Schleiermacher that religion was a feeling. Religion is that deep sense of our need for God, of our recognition of the transcendent, and so for Schleiermacher, that feeling resides in each person, and each person is fundamentally religious. Bart scoffs at this. He says, in reality, that's just Schleiermacher talking about man in a loud voice and calling it theology. God is bigger than that. God makes himself known to human beings, and human beings can have no apprehension of God, no recognition of God, without God's self-revelation. Rahner wants to sit in between. He wants to bring these two together. So, he wants to also correct the problems of each of these theologians. Where Schleiermacher has said that human beings have a feeling of God at the center of them, and then they construct religious categories based on their cultural location in the world, Rahner wants to say, right, human beings have been built for a knowledge of God. They do have some sense, some precognitive sense of God, and yet what they need is for God to reveal categorical religion. In that sense, he sounds more like Bart. Bart, remember, has always been focused on emphasizing that God makes God's self known. We couldn't know him unless God makes himself known. Rahner sees that as a problem as well. And he says, well, we have to ask, though, under what conditions could we understand something about God? How is it even possible for a human being to understand something about God? It's not good enough simply to say that God does reveal himself. We have to ask, how is a human being structured so that a human being can be the recipient of God's revelation? And so Karl Rahner is going to begin what we call a theology from below. He's going to start with human categories and trace a fundamental theology that tries to articulate how the human being is built in such a way that a human being can receive God, or can know God, or can come into relationship with God. Now, Rahner is usually associated with a phrase called Transcendental Thomism. It's a difficult phrase, but it actually makes a lot of sense, and let's see how Rahner goes about getting the center of his theology here. Thomas Aquinas, as a good Catholic, developed an understanding of nature and grace in which grace builds upon or perfects nature. That is, human beings have been created human by nature, and then God doesn't override their free will. God doesn't get in the way of their autonomy. Rather, God places grace on the human being to perfect their nature, to elevate the human nature, to make the human nature better than it was before, and therefore in capacity to be in relationship with God. That's Aquinas' insight here that Rahner wants to take and use. Now, Rahner has studied under Martin Heidegger, and he develops a doctoral dissertation on Aquinas through the thought of Martin Heidegger, so he's heavily indebted to Martin Heidegger as well. Heidegger is focused on existential reality. That is, how is it that human beings exist? One of Heidegger's existentials, as he calls them, is, for example, that human beings are beings toward death. We as human beings recognize we're going to die, and so that sets the shape of our life in a particular way. We recognize that we're finite, we must accomplish things in the short time that we have on earth, and so that motivates us, that moves us toward the life goals that we form. Rahner takes these existentials and he takes them a step further. We'll talk about one today, that is the supernatural existential. That is, that God gives grace to every human being, that grace builds upon nature, that grace is present in nature, and therefore that each human being, as its very existence, lives in a graced reality in relationship with God, whether that human being knows it or not. The other thing that Karl Rahner is trying to do here is to build a fundamental theology. Now, with fundamental theology, the goal is to construct the foundations for dogmatic or systematic theology by rationally justifying the belief in God's revelation in Jesus. It's something of an apologetic work here. It attempts to show through philosophical reflection on human experience that belief in this revelation is not arbitrary or a sheer leap of faith, but that it's a reasonable kind of belief. So what Rahner is going to do is to build this fundamental theology showing through the very nature of human existence how human beings have been built to be in relationship with God. Then he takes theologically the claim that God's grace is present to human beings, that grace builds upon or perfects nature, and he shows that human beings were built for God and shows the structure in which that works. So his goal here is to make Christian belief possible with intellectual honesty. He's dealing with secularists like Jean Paul Sartre, Friedrich Nietzsche, who claim that the idea of God is an impediment to human existence. God gets in the way. For human beings to live responsibly as human beings, they need God to be out of the picture. No God. Atheism is the only way in which human beings can take account of their own life, be responsible for themselves as human beings, because they're not answering to God all the time. They are autonomous creatures who take their own responsibility seriously. And Rahner says that's simply false. There's nothing of an impediment that God puts in the way of human beings. Rather, God is the horizon. God is the point to which all human existence focuses. And so human beings naturally orient themselves toward God. They naturally ought to orient themselves toward God for their great fulfillment in life. And Rahner is going to show how that's possible and why that's reasonable. Now, there's no doubt in my mind that Rahner's theology of nature and grace will be the most enduring aspect of his thought. And so we want to focus in on that aspect of his thought, to the exclusion of almost all others today, in order to really understand this one. And if we can make sense of it, then we can understand how to read Karl Rahner, and we can understand what we would expect Karl Rahner to say in particular situations about grace. For Karl Rahner, every human being is built with the potentia obedientialis. That is the potency for obedience to God. Human beings have been constructed in such a way that they can have relationship with God. That's the very essence of what it means to be human, to be structured in such a way that one can have relationship with God. That's already a gift, but it's part of nature. It's part of the image of God. This is not grace. It's being part of the image of God here. It contains no real presence of God to the human being and no real knowledge of God. But it does ask a question. It means that human beings have this restless sense about them, and they tend toward wanting to know God. So Rahner thinks that in all human experience, human beings are really on the horizon, striving toward God. Now, built onto this is what Rahner calls the second level, transcendental revelation. Now, this is grace building upon nature. So human beings by nature have the potentiality for obedience to God. By grace, they have transcendental revelation. Now, let's define this term transcendental. Transcendental means the conditions for the possibility of an experience. So, human beings have transcendental revelation. They have the conditions for the possibility of an experience of God's grace. And Rahner claims that all human beings have this because of the death of Christ and because of the Holy Spirit's work in the world. All human beings have transcendental revelation. All of them have this grace that God is meeting them, God is with them, God is in them in some mysterious way that they don't know until we move to categorical religion. We could understand this something like John Wesley's reaction against Calvinism. For Wesley, if you remember, God has neutralized the depravity of human beings. Human beings are depraved by nature, but God has somehow neutralized that by the death of Christ. And so human beings are elevated to a point they can either choose God or not choose God. Now, Rahner goes one step further. He says that, no, really, God is with human beings, and human beings are capable. They have the transcendental ability, that is, the conditions for the possibility of an experience of God. God is with them, and they can experience that. Rahner calls this the supernatural existential. That is, that God's grace can sometimes break through. In our human lives that are already graced, we can at certain times experience this supernatural existential. That is, that God's grace breaks through explicitly. God can meet with us explicitly. It, of course, can't be discovered by philosophical reflection because it comes from God. This is not saving grace yet, but it is an offer of grace, we could say. It's that gracious offer of relationship with God that needs categories in order to be actualized. Rahner moves then to the third category, which is categorical revelation. Now, categorical revelation is God speaking to the person. It has the character of an event. God speaks to man and makes known to him something which cannot be known always and everywhere in the world simply through the necessary relation of all reality in the world to God in man's transcendence. What he's saying is that here God is contributing something to the individual in a manner of speaking that the individual could not get simply through experience of the world, simply through human striving. God really is communicating to that human being. One channel for this, but not the only channel for this, are the many religions in the world. These are categorical expressions of the quest for God, and Rahner thinks that God can be in those. Rahner is also very careful. These are also tainted with wrong. They are not the fullness of revelation. They're not even maybe helpful revelations of God. They in fact may distract us from God in their more corrupt forms. And so Rahner is very careful not to say that all religions are automatically good. He does say, though, that they could be channels by which God meets with people. But they're not the only channels. There may be other channels. It always happens in the conscience, but it could be through the ordinary events of life that God is able to communicate to an individual, speak to them in some way, providing them with some knowledge. For Rahner, that's not good enough. That's not what God intended to do with human beings. There's one further step, and that's public official revelation, Christian faith. Christ then is that omega point of the world. He is the thing to which all human striving is moving. It is Christ, God among us, to which we have been created in the first place, and our striving then reaches its fulfillment in the person of Christ. One interesting point for Rahner is that he would say, even if human beings hadn't sinned, Jesus Christ would still have come to our world. God the Son would still have become incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ, and therefore God would be among us. That's necessary because that was always God's plan, that God and humans be together, that God would be among us, and so the incarnation still would have happened, not for the need of sacrificial death, but for the purpose of God being with human beings, which has always been God's intent. One of the big questions that Rahner asks is, well, what if someone receives categorical revelation, but never receives public official revelation? That is, what if that person lives in some place on earth where they simply can't hear the gospel, where they would know nothing about the public official revelation of Christianity, but nonetheless, they participate in categorical revelation in some way. God comes to meet with them, perhaps through their religion, perhaps through their cultural experience, perhaps individually in some particular way, and God meets with them and speaks to them. And this leads Rahner to the notion of the anonymous Christian. Now, many people have been nervous about Rahner's phrase, anonymous Christian. It sounds as if someone is being claimed to be a Christian even though he's not. The person would say, I'm not a Christian, but the Christian would say, you really are. And this makes that term a bit awkward, but let's understand what Rahner is saying here. Anonymous Christianity means that a person lives in the grace of God and attains salvation outside of explicitly constituted Christianity. They have categorical revelation, but they don't have official public revelation of Christianity. Then Rahner says, because I hold that everyone depends on Jesus Christ for salvation, on the one hand, and because I hold that many live in the world who have not expressly recognized Jesus Christ, then there remains, in my opinion, nothing else but to take this postulate of anonymous Christianity. He says, I don't like the term either, but I have to use it because it gets at the reality of many persons in the world who may be saved by the grace of Christ, but may not know that they're participating in the grace of Jesus Christ. This language has worked its way into Vatican II, and so into the official Catholic teaching, in two places. First is in Lumen Gentium, and let me highlight a few important things about this. So, those can attain to everlasting salvation who through, first point here, is no fault of their own, do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, yet sincerely seek God, whatever that may mean. They sincerely are seeking God, and they are moved by grace. Now notice with Rahner's theology that all persons are moved by grace because they have the supernatural existential. So all persons are being moved by grace. The question is how sincerely they seek God. The council doesn't claim to know that about any particular person. It simply says hypothetically, if a person is sincerely seeking God, being moved by grace, and they show that by striving in their deeds to do his will, as it is known to them through the dictates of their conscience. So, The best that any human being can do is follow their conscience on something. This is not works salvation for Rahner. It's not as if someone is trying to earn their way to God. It's simply as if they're responding to God as well as they know. In that case, one could sincerely cooperate with the grace of God. In Gaudium et Spes, it's said again in a different way, since Christ died for all men, we ought to believe, the Council says, that the Holy Spirit, in a manner known only to God, offers to every man the possibility of being associated with this Paschal mystery. We don't know how that happens, the Council says, but we ought to think that God does offer that possibility, rather than simply letting people go to hell who have never known about this God. Inclusivism means that Christ is the only way to salvation. But God can communicate that to salvation to persons who may have never heard, who may have gotten a wrong perspective about that Jesus, and therefore have believed in some misinformation, and they have a bad attitude about Christianity as a result. They've never seen the real thing. And God can then communicate salvation through the grace of Jesus Christ, and only through the work of Christ, to that person, even though that person is not explicitly conscious of knowing that Jesus Christ. That person, Rahner would say, and many Catholics today would say, will at some point in the future come to know that Jesus Christ, probably after death. Well, would this stop evangelism if we held to inclusivism? That is, if all persons get that offer of God anyway, then what's the use of going and doing evangelism? For Rahner, it's very clear. Christ is the omega point. He is the point to which all human beings strive. For all human beings, it is good and necessary and fulfilling and appropriate that human beings move toward an explicit understanding of Christ. And the purpose of sharing the gospel is to help human beings find fulfillment, to move toward an understanding of Christ, and explicitly enter into salvation.